It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Maren Niehoff from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and we much appreciate it that she joins us also in current circumstances. Professor Niehoff is no stranger to the UK. She did her baccalaureate in Wales, didn't she? In the United World College, also attended by Dutch royalty. And later you returned to the UK to do a PhD with Geza Vermesh at the other place. Professor Niehoff doesn't need any introduction, as I spelled out in the invitation. She's a well-known Philonic scholar, and her recent biography of Philo has already been translated in German, French, Italian, and Hebrew. Are there any more languages in the pipeline? More translations?
Not that I know of.
Okay. And I also noted her work on Platonic textual communities is being currently included in a Chinese translation of Plato's Timaeus. So it's all very encouraging that Plato is becoming available in Chinese. I'm not sure if there are already existing translations, but that's quite interesting. Mm-hmm. In recent publications since last year or so, 2020, Professor Niehoff is also broadening out to Paul, and she currently works on a project entitled Writing to the Romans, Paul's Epistle in Context. And today's paper on a Roman portrait of Abraham in Paul's and Philo's later exegesis seems to be part of this project, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. We are extremely pleased that she is sharing this research with us today. She was due to be in Cambridge at St. John's, but given the current pandemic, she's postponing her actual visit till 2023. So I guess that's the opportunity to see the finished product. So it's excellent to have a preview, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, George, for this very kind introduction. And thank you for everybody to join this seminar. I'm extremely pleased to share some really new work on Philo and Paul. And this indeed, as George mentioned, is a new project. I'm trying to move out and broaden my the insights that I have gained from Philo to other Greek speaking authors who addressed Roman audiences. And of course, Paul's letter to the Romans is a self-evident target for my search, because it declares itself as an address to the Romans, even though the author hadn't actually arrived there yet, as he says in his famous introduction, but still it is a clear self-presentation of a Greek-speaking author, a Jew like Philo, who actually aims at gaining the attention of Roman audiences. So obviously the question of the Roman context of the letter to the Romans is a very long debated topic, and it has been debated very controversially. I guess most scholars today still think that Paul, as most, if not all, early Christians and Christ believers were anti-imperial, and they opposed Roman discourses, Roman symbols of power, and kind of constructed their own religion in contrast to Rome. That's in some ways a prevalent picture. There are other voices, though, who think that Paul, particularly in Romans, does in fact also testify to a translation of Roman terms into Greek. So there's, for example, the work of Thomas Schumacher, who thinks that pistis, Paul's notion of pistis, is actually a kind of a translation of the Roman fides with all its connotations of loyalty and so on. So I'm hoping to contribute today to this debate about the Roman context of Romans by looking at an exegesis, the interpretation of Abraham, and by comparing Philo and Paul. And I believe that this exercise in exegesis can actually help us to understand an increasing Roman orientation if we go from Paul's image of Abraham in Galatians to his image in Romans. And I'm not debating now whether Corinthians where this belongs chronologically, I simply assume that Galatians is earlier than Romans, and thus I compare the image of Abraham in those two letters, the earlier one in Galatians and the later one in Romans. And I would like to suggest that the differences, the really remarkable differences in narratology, in theology between the two letters regarding Abraham, they can in fact be explained by reference to Philo and his increasing orientation towards Roman audiences. So just to give you a little background for my argument, Philo, who is obviously less known to this audience and altogether less known than Paul, was born around 20 before the Common Era. He lived around approximately up to 47 of the Common Era. The only clearly identifiable date that we have within this lifespan is the embassy to Gaius Caligula. He left Alexandria in the autumn of 38 after the pogrom in Alexandria, and he must have spent at least 4 years in Rome and continued the negotiations with Claudius after Gaius was assassinated in early 41. So that's the only thing that we really know about him. I have argued in my recent biography, intellectual biography of Philo, that we can actually puzzle together the chronology of his works. And I have argued that the allegorical commentary addresses a Jewish audience in Alexandria and is really a kind of a commentary in the Homeric style for an audience that is very versed in the biblical text. And Philo goes about explaining minute details, words, sentences, and raises textual problems of plausibility, of apparent contradictions between verses for an audience that is highly invested in the biblical text, namely fellow Alexandrian Jews. When Philo arrives in Rome, obviously there was no use anymore for this very detailed systematic commentary of the biblical text, and he turns to broader Roman audiences, Greek-speaking Roman audiences, and presents Judaism in a new fashion, in what I would call a Roman key. He switches from Bible exegesis to more general literary genres, such as biography, philosophical treatises, and historical treatises, all of which are very easily accessible. They don't require any prior background in Judaism or the Jewish scriptures, and they also turn to motifs and values that Philo could expect to be particularly popular among Roman audiences. And I see this intellectual activity as part of his diplomatic mission in Rome. When he actually was waiting for an audience with Gaius, he turned in the meantime to the media and appealed to broader audiences to prepare for the momentous political decisions that were at stake during his embassy. In the Roman context, Philo also began, as I said, to write biographies. And one of the biographies that we have is, in fact, Abraham. The life of Abraham belongs in that Roman context as far as I can see. And my point today will be that there are some interesting similarities between the more textual approach to the issue of Abraham's image in Galatians and Philo's allegorical commentary on the one hand, and the more kind of vivid characterization of Abraham as an exemplum, as a personal hero who is actually tried who successfully passes a trial of faith in the later Roman writings of both of them. So what I thought, is this clear? Are there any questions so far? And I really welcome anybody speaking right away. Both I'm used to Israeli audiences and they're famous for raising questions all the time. And also since we unfortunately have to do with a Zoom and I cannot be personally present in Cambridge at this moment, I really, at least I would really like to have your questions and your thoughts as we go along, and thus perhaps animate this screen a little bit. So are there any questions so far? Okay, so what I thought I'd do today is look at Romans and analyze some of the features in Philo's portrait of Abraham, pointing out in particular what is new here in comparison to Galatians, and then turn to Philo, both some of his earlier Alexandrian writings and his life of Abraham, to show you, I hope I will convince you, that there are quite striking similarities. And then I will, the dessert, so to speak, will be some new insights from Philo's philosophical work called the probus, or that every righteous is free. And there is a passage, and this is another of the philosophical writings addressing a Roman audience. And wonderfully, Philo has a whole session there of 30 paragraphs dealing with Greco-Roman authors, poets and prose writers. And here Philo is meeting Roman audiences on their own turf. And the specific features that we see in Romans, namely the vivid anecdote that creates a personal tension between a conflict, if you wish, an inner conflict that the hero successfully overcomes, is very prominent in the in Philo's probus, and also the notion of exemplarity, namely that ethics is in fact taught by the model of the ancestors, by exemplary ancestors. And this again is explicitly discussed in the probus, but I would argue underlies in fact both Philo's interpretation of Abraham in the life and also Paul's interpretation of Abraham in the letter to the Romans. Okay, is this all clear? So we have 3 steps and we will have 3 different sets of text. So I will start sharing the screen, and I hope that perhaps you have had the time to look at some of the texts. In any case, they are so famous, but some of you will have noticed that I translate them somewhat differently from the canonical translations, and there will be opportunity to discuss this as well, of course, but I would just like to walk with you through some of the main texts and point out these features that I see. Okay, now we have to here we go. Yeah, here we are. Okay, so let's start with Romans. As you all remember, the portrait of Abraham comes at the beginning of chapter 4 in answer to the question whether then the law is abandoned, and Paul affirms that on the contrary, no, we will keep up the law. And now Abraham comes in to illustrate in what sense Paul intends the law to be kept. In what sense? And this opening already is very different, by the way, from Galatians, where Abraham is discussed in the context of a complete dichotomy between a rather negatively perceived law and faith. Here in the letter to the Romans, it's the opposite. Abraham is presented as somebody who will show how the law can in fact be fulfilled. And to me, this seems not accidental at all, because the Romans, of course, were known for their pride in their law. Cicero already praises Roman law, and he also praises it as the one thing that the Romans brought to the whole civilized world. I think Paul had a very good sense, if I may put it bluntly, that if you write to the Romans and you start by completely rejecting the law, this will be just a kind of a non-starter in Rome. So I think he very carefully phrased his letter and presented Abraham as a model of fulfilling the law. Okay, so what then shall we say has Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh found? For if Abraham was justified out of deeds, he has reason for pride, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? But Abraham trusted God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. For the reward of one who performs works is not counted according to grace, but rather according to his due. But to the one who does not perform works, but trusts him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. As David also has said, a beatitude over the person to whom God counts righteousness apart from deeds. Blessed are they whose iniquities have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not reckon. Does this beatitude then apply to circumcision or also to the foreskin? For we say that faith has counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted? Why he was in the circumcision or in the foreskin? Not in the circumcision, but in the foreskin. And he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness of faith in the foreskin, so that he may become the father of all the uncircumcised believers, and so that righteousness may also be counted to them. Indeed, that he may become the father of circumcision for those who are not only of the circumcision, but also follow in the footsteps of the faith of our father Abraham when he was in the foreskin. And there are some of you who are familiar with Romans, you will see that the last sentence is extremely controversial, whether there are two groups implied or one. I think it is one, and I will be very happy to discuss this if anybody wishes me to discuss it in detail in the discussion. But so what do we have here in fact? We have here an image of Abraham, who Paul now admits did actually have circumcision. He did receive circumcision, and the question now is whether it was before or after his faith. And Paul, of course, emphasizes that it was before. But note that in Galatians, Paul never admits that Abraham actually was circumcised. In Galatians, on the contrary, we have the image that his apparently Jewish competitors who had also been active as missionaries in Galatia, they had convinced the Galatians that Abraham was indeed, of course, as it is told in Genesis 17, he was circumcised, his whole house was circumcised, and it was the Galatians were eager to circumcise themselves, and they brought textual proofs to show that they were right against Paul, who on the face of it was preaching against the scriptures, against Genesis chapter 17. Now in Romans, you see, Paul is not arguing with proof texts that his competitors or other people in the audience may have quoted to him. He is telling them, he's explaining to them the nature of Abraham's faith. And most strikingly, in complete contrast to the Galatians, the Romans seem to be worried about the prospect of circumcision. The Galatians are very eager to circumcise themselves, and they prompt Paul to explain why they should not do so, whereas the Romans, by contrast, seem to be worried that their adopted ancestor, or the ancestor whom Paul is suggesting to them to adopt, did in fact undergo circumcision, right? And therefore, Paul deals with the difficulty that Abraham in fact did have circumcision, and now he has to explain how come that there was a circumcision if already faith was enough. And he explains that he received it as a sign. The sign of circumcision is a seal, right? So you see here, kai semeon elaben peritomes es fragida, tes diakai osunes, tes pisteos, tes ente acrobustia. So we have the semeon and we have the fragida, and that is his explanation, somewhat apologetic explanation, why nevertheless Abraham did have circumcision. And so it is a seal, a sign, and it is a sign of authority that he was given after he had already faith, so that he could become the father of all the uncircumcised believers. And here also you see a very strong rhetorical shift from Galatians to Romans, because here in Romans, it's the father of all the uncircumcised believers that is in the focus of Paul's rhetoric, whereas in Galatians he asks all the time, who are the kind of the real sons, the huioi of Abraham, whether the real sons are the circumcised or the uncircumcised. In Romans, the shift is towards Abraham as the father of all the uncircumcised believers, and on the basis of his faith. So the question has shifted from who are the real sons to Abraham as the father, and Abraham as somebody who only had circumcision as a seal for the really important thing that had happened before, namely his faith. And as you can also see, the additions here to Galatians, of course, is also the comparison to the worker who receives his salary, and also the quotation from Psalms. And I will not go into these now, I have discussed them elsewhere. Just to say that these are also rhetorical techniques to bring the reader from the very precise context of Genesis 15:6 to a more general context that Paul apparently felt was feasible to the Romans, but wasn't at all necessary for the Galatians, who were all up with their quotations, and they were eager to know what Paul would answer to their proof text. Right, and in the Galatians, we have a kind of a battle of proof texts, and Paul draws on Habakkuk, and the Galatians bring in Leviticus, and so we have an exchange here of proof texts. And instead, in Romans, we have this general comparison, and we have Psalms that gives a general message but doesn't directly speak to the text. Now, the real innovation comes in the second part of the portrait of Abraham in Romans 4:18 to 24. And maybe somebody else would like to read so that we can have some audience involvement. Would anybody like to read? Oh, there's some noise here.
I would be happy to do it. Could you make the text bigger?
Pardon?
Could you magnify the text a bit?
Yes. Is that okay?
Oh, that's so much better. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, right. David.
He believed against hope with hope that he would become the father of many nations, in accordance with what is written, thus will be your sperm. And not having been weakened in the faith, he observed his own body, which had already died, as he was about 100 years old, as well as the deathly state of Sarah's womb. He didn't doubt God's promise by lack of faith, but became strong in faith, giving honor to God, and he became totally convinced that he is able to do what he has promised. Therefore, it was counted to him as righteousness. The statement "it was counted to him" was written not only for his sake, but also for the sake of us, to whom it will be counted, as we trust in him who has raised Jesus our Lord from the dead.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. So here, I think this is the highlight of Abraham's portrait in Romans, and there is no hint to this drama in Galatians at all. Paul is setting up here a potential contrast, the hope against hope, and I translate the par elpida strongly here, not just beyond hope, but hope against hope. And the obstacle to hope, to Abraham's leap into faith, is the very fact of his old body, right? Everybody remembers God promised Abraham and Sarah offspring when they were very old. And Abraham looks and he realizes that his own body was already as good as dead, and that Sarah's womb had withered and was also as good as dead. So Paul obviously refers here to the tension that we have already in the biblical text. Sarah, in fact, in the biblical text is laughing, and this is not mentioned here, but the tension is there, and Paul sets up here this drama that Abraham could have, or in fact, he had every reason not to put his faith into God, seeing the elderly bodies of himself and his wife. But nevertheless, he did put his faith into God. He did not doubt. And this was what was acknowledged, that this was counted as righteousness. Now, Paul makes a second very dramatic, enormously important rhetorical move, and this, of course, is connecting the ancient figure of Abraham in the biblical text with all of us. So the text is now taken to speak directly to the reader. Alakai di hemas. It also speaks to us. So all boundaries of time and space are collapsed. The text becomes a kind of a very personal address to any reader who will read the letter to the Romans. So Paul has offered here a reading, a highly personal reading, a reading that sets up Abraham as a model for us to imitate. And his reading is the opposite of an antiquarian or scholarly reading that would go into the details of the text, or that would ask about the historical intention of the author, or what have you. It is a passionate, ethical reading that sets up Abraham as a hero who dramatically succeeded in the trial of faith that was put to him, right? And in this passionate personal reading, I would argue, and we will see later, I think is very much in line with contemporary Roman discourses. Seneca was famous for ridiculing scholarly work on the ancient authors as a complete waste of time. And I think that Paul's portrait of Abraham here precisely fits this animated spirit, this ideal of reading for ethical purposes. We have already discussed, I have already mentioned some of the features of Galatians. I guess we can skip this. Just to show you again the proof texts that come up here, and the far more, maybe I could call it historical approach in Galatians. Now let's move. Are there any questions so far? Any queries or comments or? Okay, so let me introduce Philo and explain how I see the similarities or the similar journeys that they take from Greek audiences in the East to a more central Roman perspective. Philo has a lot to say about Abraham in the allegorical commentary, but strikingly, nothing really has to do with his personality. It's all about the different texts, and it's about the minutiae of those different texts. So here, for example, and it's all again about talking with fellow Jews who know these texts extremely well. So the first example is about the expression in the Septuagint, exegagen auton exo, and obviously there were in Greek, you have the XX redundancy, stylistic redundancy, which in biblical Hebrew is great style, in Greek far less so. And apparently there were Alexandrian Jews who questioned the stylistic quality of the Septuagint, and they were laughing about it, and they say, can somebody be let out away inside, or vice versa, go in outside? So they were questioning this, and you can see that Philo responds very firmly. Philo will always be on the side of the given text. He will always defend the text by different methods, and we don't really need to go into the nature of his solution here, but you can trust me that he will always find a solution. The next text shows that pistis is seen by Philo as the most perfect of the virtues. So Philo, like Paul, thinks that pistis is a very important virtue. He puts it into the center of his ethics, but he disconnects it from circumcision. So Abraham is really praised for his pistis, and his covenant with God is through pistis. It's in Philo, he never mentions the circumcision as part or as a sign or as a sealing of the covenant. But at the same time, Philo, and I would argue in contrast to Paul, he assumes that pistis in God, and which implies flight from the world, does nevertheless imply law observance. So circumcision for Philo is self-evident as part of the halachic framework that Abraham accepted, and Philo, of course, relied on the biblical explicit biblical saying by God to Abraham, to Jacob, that Abraham in fact fulfilled all his laws. So in the allegorical commentary, you see intensive exegetical work on biblical verses pertaining to Abraham, but no interest in character. There is no interest in character. There is an interest in types, in good and bad types. Unfortunately, women in the allegorical commentary, they're always on the side of the sense perception and material. And there is a great interest in theological concepts such as pistis, such as the creator God, who cannot be seen and cannot be touched. But there is no portrait of character, and there is no biography that would in fact show the development of a person's character. This we get, the portrait of character, we get in Philo's Roman works. And in particular regarding Abraham, of course, in his life of Abraham. Now, interestingly enough, and again, I would say this has to do with the Roman context, Philo, like Paul, before introducing Abraham, speaks about the law. And he, in fact, says that even though the early biblical patriarchs, they lived before the law was, in fact, revealed and given by God to the Israelites, they already implemented the law by following the laws of nature, which are identical to the revealed law later on. So you see that there is a concern here to show that at the beginning of the tradition, there was already law observance observance, and there is no clash between a kind of a primitive stage of the nation without a law and a later stage when the law was written down or revealed, or whatever you have. So both writers in their Roman period are eager to show that there is law observance already at the earliest stage, and also in the case of Abraham. Now, in Philo, in the life of Abraham, is also interested in the trials of the character. And we have here a scene in Abraham 111:12 that is very similar and very close to what we find in the letter to the Romans. Here too, Philo is concerned about the promise that was given to Abraham and Sarah, and inquires to what extent they were in fact able to put their faith into God and believe this promise. Philo goes a bit further than Paul, and he says the following: but there Abraham and Sarah did not trust the promises because of the implausibility of the thing, right? Peritu pragma apistu. So that's a kind of a nice play on words. For they were already advanced in years and had given up on having a child because of their great old age. Moses says that after the woman heard the promise, she laughed at the beginning. And thereafter, when the angels said, "Is anything impossible with God?" she was ashamed and denied the laughter. For she first learned this doctrine virtually from the cradle and knew all things were possible with God. So here you see Philo treating exactly the same problem as Paul, but he focuses on Sarah as the character who deals with the kind of problem of faith, seeing God's promise. And she goes through a process of rejecting the promise, and then being ashamed and recalling her learning in her early days. And here you can also see this is a nice piece of evidence of Philo assuming that a biblical matriarch in fact was taught, that she was taught the doctrine virtually from the cradle. And by the way, according to Philo, it is Sarah who recognizes the angels as angels because she was brought up in a proper religious way. So I would argue that in Romans and in the life of Abraham, we see a similar interest in character, and both authors are keen to explore the possibilities of an inner tension, seeing God's promise. Paul really exploits this wonderfully, in wonderful rhetoric for the portrait of Abraham. And he presents him as a hero who does not succumb to his doubts. And in an additional move, he also sets Abraham up as a direct model for his readers, which Philo does not do. And this may also have to do with the fact that Philo comes as a diplomat to Rome. He's not interested in kind of converting the Romans. He's interested in seeking their sympathy for Judaism. So his mission is quite different from Paul's mission, who really wants to engage his readers as potential followers of Abraham. But certainly you see there is a very similar interest, and I would argue that Paul exploited the biblical potential even more effectively than Philo, with the potential Roman readers actually agreeing to become children of Abraham. So far, Philo on Abraham. I would like now to conclude with a few lines from the Probus. This book is one of Philo's least read books. In fact, I'm currently working on a commentary, and I have a really hard time to find any secondary literature on this book. The only people who really seem to have read it are the translators into the through different languages. But I would argue it is an extremely important book. As it was written, it is a general philosophical book. It has the famous passage about the Essenes. That is perhaps something that everybody knows, the description of the Essenes in the Probus. But the whole book is really written for a Roman audience. It has a very nice introduction, appealing to a Theodoros, who we don't know who exactly this person was, but it's quite likely that this book in fact emerged in the salons of Rome, where probably also Josephus was writing his works, and Luke may be appealing to something similar in the introduction to his Gospel and Acts. So we have a setting here that is really characteristic of the Roman setting in the first century. And the Probus, this I should also mention, has a unique passage, 2 paragraphs about Brutus and Caesar. Brutus, of course, being the assassin of Caesar, and Philo here addresses very topical and urgent questions of the image of Caesar and of Brutus that had in fact been sparked by a discussion under Gaius Caligula in Rome, when Cremutius's Roman history were republished after they had been repressed under Tiberius. So Philo arrives in Rome under Gaius when there was really a fierce discussion between monarchists and republicans in Rome about the memory of Caesar and Brutus, and of course the big question whether it was legitimate to kill a tyrant. So the Roman context of the Probus is quite clear, both from the introduction and the specific interpretation of Brutus and Caesar. In the section on poets, on Greco-Roman poets and prose writers, we have really marvelous passages that are quite unique to Philo. I can do some publicity here for Philo. We have 14 lines of an otherwise lost satire play by Euripides, and we have very rare, if not exclusive quotations from concerning Polyxena also in Euripides' Hecuba. We also have a kind of philosophy of exemplarity, because Philo explains that philosophers all imitate Heracles, and he uses here the words really of imitation, neomai, and he thus he says that learning ethics is really about imitating a good model. So that's his philosophy in the Probus. Moreover, he describes non-Jewish heroes in very lively details, and he also gives us, he's very keen on the kind of conflict of the soul and the inner processes that a person goes through. So maybe, David, would you like to read some more? We have very nice stories here about Anaxarchus and Xeno the Eleatic.
Definitely. Okay. Were Anaxarchus or Xeno the Eleatic perhaps also heroes or of divine offspring?
This Philo asked after having discussed Heracles in detail, right? And there was somebody who thought maybe Heracles is too divine to be a model for human beings. And then Philo comes up with Anaxarchus and Xeno, who clearly are human heroes. Yes.
By no means. When they were tortured through newly manufactured outrages by fierce tyrants who were by nature harsh and had become still more savage in their case, they disregarded the dangers with great contempt, as if they were carrying alien bodies or those of enemies. From the beginning, they accustomed their soul through love of knowledge to leave behind the partnership with the passions, and to embrace instead education, and wisdom. They made their soul a refugee from the body and proved her to be an associate of prudence and courage and the other virtues.
Yes. So here again, you see a trial, right? You have these philosophers, they are put on trial by the tyrants, and Philo is keen to explain how, in fact, they were able to withstand the tortures. And so he has this whole thing about their souls, and then we get into some of the gory details. Now, maybe, David, you are interested in the next paragraph.
Sure, I like gory details. Thus, when one of them, Xeno, was interrogated and tortured so that he would utter something of the things that should not be disclosed, he showed himself stronger than fire and iron, the mightiest elements in nature. He gnawed off his tongue with his teeth and threw it at his torturer, so he could not be pressed to divulge unwillingly things that are better kept in silence.
Yes, so this story about Xeno was quite famous, and it was it is first attested in Cicero and Valerius Maximus, Tiberius's court philosopher. And Valerius has a particularly horrifying scene. He even says that Xeno not only gnawed off his tongue, but he also threw it into the mouth of his torturer, who was so astonished about his stoic resistance that he was kind of open-mouthed, and he had his got the tongue right into his mouth. So obviously you can see that these are kind of really sensational stories, which are meant to kind of to hook the reader, right? We are also astonished about these things that we wake up and we kind of let ourselves identify with the heroes. Yes, and then we have another nice story about Anaxarchus.
The other, Anaxarchus, said most patiently, "Crash Anaxarchus' skin, but Anaxarchus himself you cannot crash." These words of boldness, which are full of courage, surpass in no small measure the noble birth of the heroes, for the latter's renown stems from their parentage and not from free will, while the former's fame derives from consciously chosen virtues, which naturally render immortal those who genuinely apply them.
Yes, thank you very much, David. So here, this is a very interesting comment on the part of Philo, right? He says, well, Heracles was heroic in all the trials that he went through, but that's perhaps not so impressive as human beings, because he, having Zeus as his father, he was kind of predestined to be heroic, whereas human beings are so from their free will, right? So they have to make a conscious choice. And this again is exactly what is of interest to Philo, this conscious choice, the conscious choice of virtue, rather than being born into it. Yes, and then I have another story about Diogenes, and here again some publicity about Philo. Philo is our only source in the 1st century CE, giving us 4 anecdotes about Diogenes. Some of them are repeated later in Laertius, and 3 of them appear in the pseudepigraphic letter of Crates, Diogenes' student. But those pseudepigraphic letters are much more popular, and they really miss the witty humor of Diogenes. So obviously we have here a later, more popular form of cynicism than we find in Philo. So he's an extremely precious source in the first century. And now perhaps we don't want to get into all the details, but here again we have situations of trials, of confrontation. Diogenes, as you can see, he has been caught by pirates apparently, and he is sold on the slave market. And one of the potential bias comes up and says, what do you know? And Diogenes responds boldly to rule man. And again, you can see this is the anecdote that also appears later in Laertius, in the famous 6th volume of his Lives of the Philosophers. But you can see that Philo uniquely is interested in the morale of the story. So in how come that Diogenes was able to make this bold statement, given that he was on the slave market as a slave. And this response, it seems, came from within his soul, which produces a free and noble and naturally royal disposition. Right? In the next story, Diogenes embarrasses somebody who appears as a homosexual, of whom the disease of effeminacy had taken hold, so he did not look like a man. So he came up to him and said, "Buy me, for you seem to me to require a man." And it's Andros here that he requires. So there is a play on words, a kind of a husband or a man, whereas in Laertius it's despotes. That's the version there. So Philo's version is again more interesting, more sophisticated. And here again you see that Philo adds a morale that inquires how this comes about and what this actually tells us about the character. And while the purchaser was thus induced to admit to the things which he himself knew, and he took refuge. Right now, so you see here sun ede, obviously this is sun eidos, the conscience, and so this is what Philo is interested in. And again, ephois he autos sun ede, so it's the things that which he himself already knew about. So again, you see Philo focuses the story on the inner personality and the challenges that are presented to the personality and the reaction that come with it. So to conclude, I would argue that the Philos Probus, with its clear Roman context, gives us a kind of an explicit, if you wish, philosophy of exemplarity, and also shows the interest in character. And I see this as a background to the lively portraits of character in the case of Abraham, both in the letter to the Romans and in the life of Abraham. In contrast to Galatians and the allegorical commentary, which treat exactly the same verses and the same passages and the topic of Abraham's faith, but with a focus on the textual dimension, and they juggle different proof texts and are less aware yet of the rhetorical potential of setting up Abraham as a kind of a very lively personal hero who can actually show the readers the way in their conflicting views about faith and about how to establish a relationship of faith with God as the main path to a covenant with the divine. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Maren, for a fascinating embedding of Paul in your reconstruction of Philo's biography, and also for this recalibration of the writings in regard to Rome. And it is quite fascinating that you found a ground for comparison, a kind of tertium comparationis in Rome, because usually, of course, we associate Philo with Alexandria, but now it appears when you embed them both in a Roman context that you find a particular discourse. So that's all fascinating. I'm sure that people would like to discuss it. So you can either raise it in the chat or just unmute yourself and pose the question, or put it in the chat if you want me to read it out.
There is already somebody, I don't know your name, it just says license 5.
Yes, Jonathan Linebaugh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your paper. I enjoyed this. I've worked on sort of comparative work in Romans 4 and Abraham and the wisdom of Solomon and a little bit of Philo. So this is...
What is your name? Just tell me what...
Jonathan Linebaugh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is taking me into sort of, especially at the end, some new text in Philo, but some good old questions to come back to. And I appreciated focusing on the second half of Romans and the way the theme of faith compares interestingly with what Philo's doing in those later texts. But I did wonder if the way the sort of stories of Abraham start in the first half of Romans 4, and the way Philo sort of writes a backstory, especially in his On Virtue, to Abraham, that sort of culminates in faith as the beginning of a movement from vice to virtue, doesn't actually put faith in a slightly different context. So for Philo, he comes out of a context of ungodliness, Chaldea, but he leaves it and he leads a life that's worthy of emulation and full of esteem. So he's sort of the one godly person who realizes that God is one, that God is uncreated, unlike his astronomer father. He leaves that context, and faith is this journey of virtue. Where Paul seems to be set in a context of universal ungodliness, all are sinners, none are righteous, no, not one. And Abraham's not justified by leaving ungodliness, but he's justified as the ungodly. His blessing is the one whose sins are not reckoned to him. And so you have this theme of charis, and the whole chapter in Romans 4, both the promise and the gift operates kata charin, according to grace, which is given to the undeserving, to the unworthy, where Philo seems to be the one person in Chaldea who's an appropriate recipient of grace, where Paul is precisely giving grace as the ungodly. And in that context, faith just seems to mean something different, if the gift that sort of gets the story going is different.
I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think that they do have different notions of faith, and I try to allude to it because that was not my main topic. I completely agree that they have very different notions of faith. My argument was more about the way that they are setting this up, the way that they are setting this up. They both of them, of course, use the word pistis in a different way, and not only in the way that you have mentioned, and I agree with you on this. That there are many other ways that their notion of pistis is very different. My point here is really about the portrait of Abraham and the way that the argument is being put forward. And so I'm only interested in other words, my comparison only rests on this Roman aspect of it. I'm trying to show that what we see in Romans as being different from Galatians, I think if we look at Philo, can be plausibly explained as Paul's increasing sensibility to Roman ways of explaining Abraham. And if in Galatians, he thought that the best way obviously was to throw back at his competitors some good proof texts, and in Romans, his strategy is completely different. And so that was really my concern, and about the kind of the rhetoric of presenting Abraham within the context that their notion of faith is indeed very different. I couldn't agree more with you than what you have just said. I think they have very different notions of faith, and this would be a very different paper to ask how theologically their notion of faith compares, or whether there is any change in their notion of faith from the different writings. This was not the purpose of my paper, but I think that it's a very worthy question that you have raised.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. I suppose the reason I ask in the context of your paper is not just to say, well, here's a way that Philo and Paul are different, because that's not that interesting. Of course, they're different in some ways and similar in some ways. But in the context of your paper, if they're both sort of doing an increasingly Roman portrait of Abraham, which I'm going to keep thinking about this. You've given me a lot of things to think about and some new texts to go back to, so I'm grateful for that. But part of what I'm initially wondering is, whether the portrait of Paul as one who's justified when ungodly, who trusts a promise when, and Paul radicalizes the image, it doesn't. He's not just old and Sarah's not just barren. He's as good as dead and Sarah's womb is dead, Paul says in Romans 4. So he sort of radicalizes the incapacity of this figure of Abraham. And so faith as in some
it's
sense,
not but mind you, in that particular case, it is Paul's Abraham who is faithful. And he, in that sense, kind of deserves God's grace more than Philos, Abraham and Sarah, because they are distrustful, and both of them are distrustful. So in that critical moment of God's announcement of the promise, it's the exact other way around. Paul's Abraham is deserving because he did not express doubt according to Paul, whereas Philos' Abraham is paradoxical because he actually lacked faith initially. So it is in that particular moment, I think that Paul's Abraham is a hero who is deserving.
yeah, I mean, I want other people to get in, so I'll stop. And I do think you're right that there is a kind of reversal, because in Romans 1, what the Gentiles don't do is give glory to God, and what Paul does do, by exercising faith, to give glory to God. So there is a profound reversal going on, which happens in a big way again in Romans 8. But there's also a sense in that the faith that is exercised is set at the site of ungodliness, of sin, of nothingness, and of death. And what it means to have faith at those points is not exactly heroic, right? To receive God is not exactly a heroic act for Paul, I would suggest. It's not even something necessarily that's exemplary. It's
why not?
This is because I think what Paul thematizes is precisely that it's God who gives at the point of nothing. So he says three things about God: that he's the one who justifies the ungodly, the one who gives life to the dead, and the one who calls into being that which is not, which all culminate in the one who raised our Lord Jesus from the dead. So these are sort of divine predicates of a unilateral divine action, which then do call forth this response. But I don't think Paul's actually thematizing the response as much as he's thematizing the gift. That's how I read Romans 4. And I just think that situates Abraham slightly different than a heroic imitation. But that's, like I said, you've given me plenty to keep thinking about. But
I think we look forward to the continuation of the discussion in 2 years' time. Interesting readings of Romans. Thank you so much for starting the conversation. And if there's time at the end, you certainly could continue it. I note three speakers or attendees who would like to speak, namely Professor Brandt, Dr. Jost, I think it was a question, wasn't it? You raised your hand. And then Dr. Friedman. Professor Brandt is the author of the Political History of Early Christianity. So I guess that his question is about Rome.
Yes, it is. But I just wondered whether David's question followed immediately on this particular discussion and whether he might like to go first.
Well, it's very kind of you. Number one, you had your hand up first, and number two, my question is actually about Rome, so maybe you would follow yours.
Yes, I was fascinated by your description of the group in Galatians with its proof text, and the group in Romans being addressed in this genre of this Hellenistic genre of didactic history, as it were. But I was also aware, of course, of one received opinion, at least, that would say that the Paul of Galatians, responding to these proof texts, was the mercurial Paul who had gone quite off his head and produced this highly radical disjunction because of the Judaicists, screaming that Barnabas had betrayed him and Peter had welched from the, sorry, that's a racist, isn't it, or something, had betrayed the original agreement. But the advantage of that received opinion is the group that Paul is addressing in Romans is a Jewish Christian group, rather miffed by the way that the Jewish heritage and the heritage of the law has been treated, and that Paul is addressing that in a church situation, I wondered what fit this had with your with your more general picture of the addressing of a general Roman culture with Roman ideas on law.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. And you have just given basically, Thomas Tobin has a wonderful book on the rhetorics in Romans, and he also has a wonderful article comparing Abraham in Galatians to Abraham in Romans. And he basically gives the conclusions that you have just mentioned about Romans kind of finding a compromise between Jewish and pagan members of the community in Rome, and thus kind of amending some of the more radical sayings in Galatians. Now, I'm not convinced that the letter to the Romans really addresses also a Jewish or Jewish Christian audience. At least my kind of, I can tell you why I think so thus far. And obviously I'm only at the beginning of my research, but the notions of Paul is already in Romans. He's quoting verses from radically new texts, and that's mostly from Psalms and prophets, which he has not quoted much or not at all, even I think in Galatians, and very little in Corinthians, in the Corinthian correspondence. And he actually sets up a kind of a new, he doesn't call it a new Torah, but I think that's what he basically does. I think he creates a new scripture for the Christ believers, which is no longer Moses's Torah. And whereas Philo regularly speaks about Moses said this, Moses said that, and it's Moses's Torah, Paul moves away from Moses as the lawgiver, and I think he does not try to integrate everybody under kind of the commandments of the Torah, but I think that he's in Romans, I think for the first time groping towards a scripture that is the scripture of the Christ believers. And Moses appears only kind of in negative connotations. There are very few references to Moses in Romans, and they're negative, and they are opposed to or Isaiah or to Sophosune. And so Moses, the kind of the traditional Jewish image of the scriptures as being Moses' scriptures, gets quite a negative image in Romans. And so I think it's quite impossible that he has in mind to kind of pacify Jewish readers. He also, at the beginning of Romans, he has this kind of caricature of the Jews as teaching the Ten Commandments, but never doing them, practicing them themselves. So I think this again wouldn't be very appealing to Jewish readers. And I think here already we also have some kind of rhetorical mechanisms to establish the community of Christ believers, irrespective of the Jews sitting next door in the synagogues, and so therefore and it's a very preliminary idea, but my preliminary impression is that the more positive attitude towards the law, which everybody notices in Romans in comparison to Galatians, is not necessarily connected to pacifying Jewish audiences, but I think has very much to do with attracting Roman audiences, because you couldn't come to Rome and tell the Romans that, law is a terrible thing. That's what the Romans stood for. That's what they were proud of. That's what they thought they brought to the whole world, a good canon of law. And so I think sitting in Corinth and writing his letter to the Romans, after spending lots of time with the Prisca and Aquila, who had been living in Rome before they were expelled by Claudius, I think Paul had a pretty good idea, both from Corinth, a vibrant Roman city, and from his friendship with the Roman citizens, that when you come to Rome, you have to have some kind of positive conception of the law, and show the Romans that your religion is a religion that will in fact operate within the law and order of the Roman Empire. It's not a subversive religion, but it's a religion that will operate within the system of the Roman Empire. And my sense is that this is what Paul was trying to do in the letter to the Romans, that's what he was trying to show. And in fact, I have found, his emphasis that you have to fulfill the law with love, and that it is a law of love, is precisely what Stoic philosophy of law was all about. Law does not count if you only fulfill it kind of technically without internal intention. And so I find that Paul's particular philosophy of the law, namely that it's a law of love, fits very beautifully with Roman discourses. And it also fits, by the way, with Philo's conception of Jewish law in his Roman writings. That's also what Philo says. He says we have the 10 Commandments, and there's no punishment set up for them, even though biblically there is a punishment set up for transgressing the 10 Commandments. And he really highlights the intention, the moral intention that is necessary to fulfill the laws. So what I'm proposing is that we can use Philo as a key to understand what a Jew writing in Greek to Roman audiences about the biblical heritage, what kind of points he would have found attractive or convincing or necessary in a Roman context to discuss. And perhaps my last point to really strengthen this point is Philo in the allegorical commentary is not interested in Jewish law. We always have this idea that all the Jews were all interested in Jewish law. No, he was not. He was all into mysticism and the ascent of the soul. And there is one tiny paragraph about law observance. And there he does not specify anything about intention. He just says it's traditional, do it, and that keeps the community together. No interest in Jewish law. But when he comes to Rome, he writes one book about the Decalogue and 4 books about Mosaic law. Amazing, right? And so you can see here that somebody coming to Rome thinks that the most important thing you can do to kind of make Judaism attractive to a Roman audience is explain in detail how all the Jewish laws are in fact enlightened laws, and they fit the kind of broader framework of the empire. And perhaps another thing, both Josephus, obviously also writing for a Roman audience, and Philo in the Hypothetica Philo, they both say that the Shabbat observance is not really about a kind of taking leisure. It's not about leisure. It's about law instruction. And both of them say that Moses set up the Shabbat to make sure that every Israelite and every family knows all the details of the law. And if you look at the Roman law books, you get this principle that you have to, that the lawgivers have to make sure that the law is known by everybody in the population, is something that is written down, I think, only at the beginning of the 2nd century. But you get the idea, the nutshell of this Roman idea, you get it in Philo and Josephus. And both of them mention this when they're talking to Roman audiences.
Excellent, thank you, Maren. Dr. Jost, followed by Dr. Friedman.
Thank you so much for this fascinating paper. I have quite a simple question, which is my ignorance of the work of Philo, but one part has almost been answered. The question is about quod omnis probus. Was Philo already in Rome when he wrote his text or not? And if we include Paul, then he was not yet in Rome when he wrote the letter.
Yes.
So what influence does this difference have on the interpretation, or how decisive is the presence in Rome in order to carry on the Roman conversation?
Yes, thank you for this question. So first of all, indeed, as I emphasized, Paul has not been to Rome when he writes the letter to the Romans. So we have a paradox here of an author who's explicitly addressing Roman audiences without having been there. Right? Whereas for Philo, we have the opposite. He never says explicitly that he's addressing Roman audiences, but we know for sure that he was there at least for 4 years. So in terms of their own kind of what they tell us about themselves, it's the exact mirror image. Now, the Probus, I think, quite clearly was written in Rome. First of all, because it doesn't address a Jewish audience, it addresses a wider Greco-Roman audience. And as I said, it has the passage about Brutus, which is very topical at the time when Philo is in Rome. And Philo obviously takes part in these Roman discussions. And I won't go into all the details, but I actually think that I can show that he even used some Latin historians to write his paragraphs about Brutus. But what difference does this make for our interpretation of Philo and Paul? So first of all, let me emphasize that I never claim and never will claim that Paul read Philo. Right? I'm not claiming that there is any historical connection between the two. Paul may have known Philo. I have no way of knowing. And I don't think this can be proven because obviously Paul and Philo wrote in very different styles, and there is no way of proving that he knew Philo. So I'm not interested in this question. I don't think it can be proven. And in a way, it's, for my mind, is also a boring question. The question that really interests me is whether their rhetorical and cultural strategies were similar, because their situation seems to be strikingly similar. Just imagine, Paul wrote his letter to the Romans about 10, maybe 20 years after Philo addressed Roman audiences in Greek on Jewish matters. You know, there is nobody else that we know of who is so similar to Paul in his Jewish background, his Greek education, and his kind of orientation towards a Roman audience. So that's what I'm fascinated by, that we have two Jewish Greek-speaking authors, one physically coming Rome, the other addressing himself to Romans. And I'm asking whether we can learn something about the way that they think about the biblical heritage by comparing them. And we are in the very lucky position with Philo that I think in his case, we can distinguish between the earlier Alexandrian writings and the Roman writings pretty clearly. Just to give you an example, for Plutarch, the historians, less the philosophers, but the historians have also argued for a strong Roman involvement of Plutarch. It has been shown that he used Roman historians for his lives of Caesar and others. Plutarch even says that he learned Latin. He has a quotation of Cicero's Lucullus, a passage. So here with Plutarch, and he mentions Romans all over the place. So it's very clear that we have here another Greek-speaking author who came to Rome. He was an ambassador as well. He spent lots of time in Rome, going back and forth between his hometown and Rome. But in the case of Plutarch, we don't have kind of earlier writings without the Roman influence on it. So we can't see how he would have written had he stayed back home in Chaeronea and just never went to Rome. So that's why I find Philo so fascinating, because in his case, it seems to be quite clear that we can distinguish the earlier works and the kind of more Roman works in the context of the embassy. So that's why I think that we have a good tool here to estimate what Philo thought would go down well with the Romans, and then see whether this also holds true for other Greek-speaking authors. And maybe just to give you one example, a favorite example of mine, in the Roman writings, the biblical women get a much better image. They become a kind of Roman matrons, and they become active, and very loyal wives, and they love their husbands, and they are loved by their husbands, and active daughters, and fantastic mothers. And in the allegorical commentary, there were nothing but symbols for sense perception. And so you could see that this became a very important issue for Philo in Rome. And if you compare this to Plutarch, you can see that in many of his discussions of the virtues of women, or on marriage, or all these treatises where he deals with women, you will be surprised that he always starts by dismissing some traditional Greek attitude and embracing Roman models. And he does it quite explicitly. So again, you can see here this kind of engagement of Roman topics by authors coming there from the Greek East.
Dr. Friedman is next. There are only 8 minutes left. So if you have any questions, the rest of the audience, do raise your hand afterwards. But the floor is now to Dr. Friedman.
Thank you. I mean, you somewhat anticipated my question already with the last 2 answers. So, but I'll throw it out there anyway. And that is, I'm curious about the connection with Rome, how necessary it is. You may say that it exists, but how necessary it is. On the one hand, Paul hasn't been there, but he's super familiar with what Romans would think on the basis of maybe Prisca and Aquila. But he hasn't had to go to Rome to find this out. Philo, I have your book. I haven't read it, but I know you argue that the exposition would be in Rome. But could you? And he has certainly spent time in Rome. We know that. But could you not say that Paul's attitude in Romans, partly he doesn't know. He knows something about the group there, but he doesn't know them. So he's hardly going to go around having proof text bashings with them before he's ingratiated himself, perhaps, you might say. On the other hand, Philo has been there, and would know what a Roman audience would be interested in. But could you not say that they could be addressing any elite audience that would be interested in law and order in whatever polis they happen to be in, anywhere in the Greek East? And that it's more a question of in the case of Philo, not addressing an internal audience about the pashat and drash of any particular verse, but more addressing a broader audience of Jews and non-Jews, but thinking of them as people who participate in Roman values wherever they are. And maybe a similar idea with respect to Paul.
Yes, great question. Thank you, David. So I guess in a way we could put it that way. We could also learn from Paul concerning the possibility that Philo not necessarily formulated his so-called Roman ideas in Rome, but like Paul, he could perhaps have formulated them in Alexandria without necessarily having a concrete Roman audience in front of his kind of mental eyes. And indeed, you are absolutely right. Alexandria, of course, had already become the capital of a Roman province, and it was no longer the proud capital of the Ptolemaic Empire, which long had lost its independence. And there was a Sebastion in the harbor of Alexandria where people could go and worship Augustus. Obviously, it was already a Roman city, and there was Roman citizenship to be had for the highest elite in Alexandria. So obviously you are right that there is an overlap, and obviously you're right that Roman culture, as in Corinth, was also present in Alexandria. You are absolutely right about it, I can only agree with you on this particular matter. I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to kind of to address these questions from the point of view of the text. So the question that I have is, I think we have to explain why in Galatians, Paul is much more fiercely attacking the law as such and saying that the law brings sin and so on, things that could sound as though he was against any sort of law. And he doesn't feel particularly kind of restrained about being misunderstood in that particular letter, because he seems to be so preoccupied to counter Peter's and others' views. And in Philo, we have to explain the really drastic change of his literary genres, of his style. He becomes much more stoic and far less kind of transcendentally Platonic. So there are these differences that we have to explain. And the explanation that I've come up with is the kind of the Roman key, that no matter how Romanized Alexandria was, it seems that Philo, and at the beginning of his career, he was really kind of immersed in the details of the biblical text, and he was discussing with fellow Jews about the minutiae of the text, and he began to develop a different approach to the biblical heritage, I think prompted by his new audiences. Otherwise, I can't explain the really dramatic changes in his work. Now, some scholars before me, they simply think, well, Philo was eclectic and there's no kind of logic to his different attitudes. And in fact, the Probus at the beginning of Philonic scholarship in the 19th century has even been declared to be not written by Philo, which is really, I can tell you, complete nonsense. I'm already well into my commentary on the Probus, and I find so many linguistic similarities that it is very clear that Philo developed their topics that he had dealt with already in the allegorical commentary, but he now develops them in radically new ways. But there are always these connections between the earlier and the later work. And you see that the allegorical commentary has something in a nutshell, which he then takes into a new direction and develops in new ways in the later writings. So I can't think of another explanation for this really quite dramatic shift in Philo's style, philosophical orientation, his appeal to obviously non-Jewish audiences. I couldn't see why, if he had simply stayed in Alexandria, why he would deal with all these things. And then you see kind of very often behind the scene in Philo's Roman writings, you see kind of Claudius's policy, you see Brutus, you see all these kind of obviously Roman concerns that crop up, and they don't have any equivalent in the allegorical commentary. So
thank you so much.
So that's the kind of my way of explaining the text.
I think a final question by Dr. Carlton Paget.
Yes, I mean, could I just put an alternative forward for his interest in another audience? I mean, the In Flacum is an important work and shows considerable difficulty for Jews in Alexandria. And you could see Philo, and you make reference to the famous passage in On the Special Laws, book 3:1, following that famous passage where he gets in a state about having been dragged from his thoughts about a higher world into the sort of world, the nasty world of politics. But you could see perfectly reasonably why he might want to address an audience that was Roman Alexandrian in the wake of the Flaccus experience. I mean, the difficulty is that we have so little to go on, but you could see an alternative, surely. And surely we can't imagine in Alexandria that there were not Stoics.
In fact, this is kind of, again, circular, because Philo is our greatest Stoic from Alexandria. We have hardly anything of Eudorus, And so basically what we have, and the anonymous commentary on the Theaetetus, as I think many excellent scholars have shown, is quite anti-Stoic. So Philo is our most Stoic exponent in Alexandria. But he did have access to Stoic ideas already in his early time, and there is in the allegorical commentary, there is Stoic stuff, yes, but Philo is still much more ambivalent about it than he is later. I would completely agree with you. I think the main thrust of your question is whether he could also have addressed Roman elites in Alexandria, and my answer would be yes. Yes, I would certainly not exclude that at all. I wouldn't exclude that at all. And certainly given the situation in Alexandria, Philo must have hoped that the elite, the non-Jewish elite in Alexandria would listen to his explanations. Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. I would assume that for Philo, there was the kind of the obvious hierarchy that the greatest hope must have been to convince the emperor, and then all the, everybody from the emperor down to the prefect and to the kind of civil elites in Alexandria. But certainly, and I think that Philo would probably have hoped that if he can, that the two really go together, the greater success he would have had in Rome, the greater success he would also have in Alexandria.
Yeah, because just on that passage that you attribute great significance to on the special
Yes.
law 3,
Yes.
really one of the few autobiographical passages in the whole of Philo, really.
Yes.
Does, of course, go on about the fact that he still wants to engage in this allegorical. I mean, if you're thinking about that, he doesn't suddenly say that there's been a shift in his way of thinking. He's still pining after that life of, being sort of above the clouds and looking down upon the earth and writing these mystic sort of works. So I just wonder whether one can deduce as much from that passage about a change in tendency.
My argument about change in tendency doesn't really rely on that passage. It relies on that passage to show the great shift in Philo's personal life. And it has been used as such by many scholars before me. I think everybody has agreed that this passage shows Philo's kind of the drastic change in his personal life, that he had to go on this diplomatic trip. And probably his brother Alexander was much more suited for it than he was. So he was dragged out of his study room, and that was, it must have been a shock for him, at least initially. But my argument for his change in orientation, again, derives from a minute analysis of the different texts, and not from that particular passage. And I emphasize that Philo is now choosing different literary genres for audiences that you cannot expect any prior knowledge about Judaism or the Jewish scriptures. And I think he also ties in much more forcefully into Roman Stoicism. And again, the particular form of Stoicism that we know from Rome, namely with emphasis on ethical teaching rather than theory, as Chrysippus and Cleanthes still propagated. So this shift in orientation derives from his different works, and then the only way to kind of question this would then be to say, well, maybe he also wrote these so-called kind of my Roman writings. Perhaps they were also written in Alexandria, and I'm not even insisting that they must have been written in Rome. I'm only saying that they must have been written during or after his embassy with Roman audiences in mind. So kind of after the Roman experience. That's really my argument. So I wouldn't even argue with you if you want him to have written them, or at least some of them perhaps in Alexandria. I wouldn't even argue with you. I would only say, well, I only insist that they were written with some awareness of Roman discourses, and that they are geared towards Roman discourses. You know, whether it was also taking into account Alexandrian Roman audiences, could be. You know, could be. And maybe, obviously, if we compare this to Josephus obviously hoped that any Greek reader would read his history. So maybe Philo was also more ambitious and thought that perhaps readers in Corinth, you know, Apollon was active there, so there must have been other Alexandrians in Corinth. So maybe he was hoping for this kind of spreading his net and his work wider. That's quite possible. But I think he did it under the impression of these Roman discourses, kind of as a lingua franca, how to address these broader non-Jewish audiences in the Roman Empire.
Well, it's a very clearly positive sign that the discussion cannot be stopped. So thanks so much again, Maren, for your stimulating paper and also for the entire Q&A. We indeed look forward to your stay in 2023.
Yes, thank you very much.
Very grateful for today's appetizer, and look forward to your longer visit, regardless whether you come as a Philonic diplomat or as a Pauline missionary. But we hope that your stay will be fruitful, at least for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.